2 years after the conquest, the Valaran Empire announced its strategic repositioning of forces from Earth. The official statement described the decision as a routine reallocation of military resources based on changing priorities in other sectors. And it emphasized that the Empire maintained full sovereignty over Earth and would return in force if circumstances required. And it made no mention of resistance or failure or defeat. Commander HFY stood on the observation deck of his flagship and watched the evacuation proceed below. And he felt older than he had ever felt in his long career. And he understood that he was witnessing something that would haunt Imperial military doctrine for generations. Human workers moved efficiently across the spaceport, loading Imperial equipment onto transport ships with the same cheerful cooperation they had displayed since the first day of occupation. And they followed orders perfectly and completed their tasks ahead of schedule and never gave any sign that they understood what was happening. This HFY found that he could not look at them anymore, and he turned away from the window and retreated to his quarters, where he would not have to see their smiling faces or hear their pleasant voices or feel the weight of their patient victory. Inquisitor Malansir had returned to Earth to file his final report, and he spent his last days on the planet walking through cities that would soon be free of Imperial presence. And he observed the humans going about their lives with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had spent 2 years trying to understand what he was seeing, and he had failed, and that failure would define the rest of his career, because he had encountered an enemy that operated outside every framework he had been trained to recognize. His final report would be classified at the highest level and restricted to senior Imperial commanders. And it would contain warnings that many would dismiss as exaggeration, but that he knew were understated. Humanity did not defeat us with weapons, he wrote, and they did not defeat us with strategy or tactics or any conventional form of warfare. And they did not even defeat us with organization, because they had no organization at all. They defeated us with patience and creativity and a willingness to suffer that we cannot comprehend. And they defeated us because they understood something about themselves that we refused to believe. They were willing to lose everything for the simple satisfaction of making us bleed. And they would have destroyed themselves completely if that destruction meant we suffered too. And we have no defense against an enemy who does not care about survival. Do not return to Earth, he concluded, and do not provoke humanity under any circumstances. And do not assume that their cooperation means submission, because it does not. They are not soldiers, and they are not rebels, and they are not even warriors, because all of those words imply a desire for victory that can be negotiated or addressed. They are maniacs, and they fight because fighting is who they are. And they will destroy themselves to destroy you without hesitation or regret. Yoon-ji stood on a rooftop and watched the Imperial ships lift off from the spaceport, and she felt nothing that she could name, not triumph, and not relief, and not satisfaction. Just a quiet emptiness that she had not expected. She had spent 2 years of her life waging a war that she never thought she would survive. And she had hurt the Empire in ways that could never be measured. And now they were leaving, and she did not know what to do with the person she had become. Beside her stood Kang Do-yoon and Park Soo-jin, 2 strangers she had never met until this morning. And they had found each other somehow in the chaos of the evacuation and had climbed to this rooftop together without speaking. They did not know what the others had done, and they did not ask. And they stood together in silence, watching the ships rise into the sky and disappear into the clouds across the planet. Other humans were doing the same thing, standing alone or in small groups and watching the invaders retreat. And none of them cheered, and none of them celebrated, and none of them waved flags or made speeches. They simply watched, and they remembered. And they understood that they had won something that could never be taken away from them. The Empire had come with overwhelming force and superior technology, and the confidence of a civilization that had never been defeated. And they had assumed that conquest meant victory and that humans would accept their fate like every other species they had been. Wrong. Admiral Corvith transmitted his final report from orbit and listed the official reasons for withdrawal and the strategic justifications for repositioning forces. And nowhere in his report did he mention that his fleet had been driven from a planet by workers and clerks and cooks and janitors. He knew the truth, and his officers knew the truth, and the soldiers who had served on Earth would carry that truth with them for the rest of their lives. But the official record would never reflect what had actually happened. The last transport lifted off as the sun set over the spaceport, and the Valoran flag was lowered for the final time. And the Imperial presence on Earth came to an end not with a battle or a treaty or a formal surrender, but with a quiet departure that felt more like Ritriagia watched until the last ship vanished from sight. And then she turned to the strangers beside her and saw her own expression reflected in their faces. And she understood that they had all paid the same price and made the same choice and become the same thing they had won. But they had also lost something that could never be recovered, because the war had changed them in ways that peace could not undo. And they would spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of what they had done. But they had won. Sujin broke the silence with words that Jihei would remember for the rest of her life. She said that the Empire would mark Earth as a planet to avoid. And she said they would classify humans as a species that should never be provoked. And she said that future generations would look at the records and wonder how a conquered people had driven away the greatest military power in the galaxy. She said that the answer was simple. And the answer was that humans had something that other species did not. Something that could not be measured or quantified or understood by anyone who had not lived it. She said that humans could hate, and they could wait, and they could endure suffering beyond any reasonable limit. And they could find satisfaction in spite when victory was impossible. She said that made them dangerous in ways that weapons could never match. Do-hyun nodded slowly, and Jihei said nothing. And they stood together on the rooftop as darkness fell over a city that was free for the first time in 2 years. The Empire added Earth to a list that existed in the most restricted archives of Imperial intelligence. A list of worlds marked with a single designation that had been used only once before in Imperial history. Any Vir Eriseo and Tiestorans would later study the Earth occupation and try to understand how it had failed so completely. And they would analyze the financial data and the casualty reports and the psychological evaluations. And they would develop theories about asymmetric warfare and decentralized resistance. But they would never truly understand, because understanding required experiencing what the Valoran soldiers had experienced. The constant pleasant smiles and the helpful cooperation and the terrible patience of a species that had decided to fight a war without armies or weapons or hoped. The humans never learned about the classification, and they would not have cared if they had, because they had not fought for recognition or revenge or any external reward. They had fought because they could not accept submission, and they had won because they refused to stop. And that was enough. Jihai walked home through streets that belonged to humanity again, and she passed buildings where she had committed acts that would never be recorded. And she thought about her brother and wondered if he would have understood what she had become. She decided that he would have, and she decided that was enough. And she walked on into the night with her hands folded in front of her and her expression calm and pleasant. The Empire was gone, and the humans remained, and somewhere in the vast archives of a galactic civilization, a single planet was marked with a warning that would endure for centuries. Do not return, the warning said, and do not provoke. And do not assume that their cooperation means what you think it means. They are not soldiers, they are maniacs, and they won. 18 months after the conquest, High Counselor Vexus stood before the Imperial Senate and faced the most difficult speech of her political career. Occupation of Earth had become a crisis that could no longer be hidden, and the costs had exceeded all projections. And the Senate demanded answers that no one could provide. And Vexus had been chosen to deliver the news that everyone dreaded. She began by presenting the financial data. And the numbers told a story that made several senators gasp in disbelief. Because the Empire had spent more resources maintaining control of Earth than it had spent conquering the previous 20 worlds. Combined equipment losses had reached unprecedented levels. And replacement costs were straining sector budgets. And the constant drain of supplies and personnel had weakened Imperial presence across the entire region. And all of this was happening on a planet that produced nothing of significant value. She explained that conventional military responses had failed because there was no enemy to respond to. And she described how increased security had accomplished nothing and how punitive measures had only encouraged more resistance. And she admitted that Imperial intelligence had no solution to offer. The military faction in the Senate responded with outrage. And they demanded to know how the greatest military force in galactic history could be defeated by primitive humans who had no weapons and no organization. And they insisted that withdrawal would be an unacceptable display of weakness. Vexus listened to their arguments and then asked a simple question that silenced the chamber. She asked what victory on Earth would look like. And she asked how long they were willing to continue losing ships and soldiers and credits for a planet that would never stop fighting. And she asked whether the Empire could afford to maintain an occupation that grew more expensive every day with no end in sight. No one had an answer. Kang Dohin sat in an interrogation room for the third time in 6 months. And the Valoran investigators asked him the same questions they always asked. And he gave them the same answers he always gave. And they found nothing because there was nothing to find. Latest failure had been a support beam in a newly constructed barracks. And the collapse had injured 12 soldiers and killed 2. And the investigation showed that the beam had been installed according to specifications with materials that met all requirements. And the only explanation was metal fatigue that should not have occurred. For Decadistoyan knew exactly why the beam had failed. And he knew that no investigation would ever discover the microfractures he had introduced during installation. And he sat in the interrogation room with his hands folded in his lap and his expression calm and patient. They released him after 48 hours because they had no evidence to hold him. And he returned to work the next morning and received an assignment to repair damage at another facility. And he smiled at his supervisor and thanked them for understanding that it was all a misunderstanding. Within a week, 3 pieces of heavy equipment at his new site suffered simultaneous mechanical failures. And the timing was so precise that investigators suspected sabotage. But they could not prove anything, and Dohin was not even questioned because he had not been assigned to work on any of the failed machines. He had simply modified them during his lunch breaks while no one was watching. And he had worn standard work gloves that left no fingerprints. And he had made changes so small that they could only be detected by someone who knew exactly what to look for. Park Sujin continued her work as a translator, and her reputation had only grown during the occupation because she was always professional and always accurate, and always willing to work extra hours when important dignitaries visited. She had developed her techniques to a level that bordered on art, and she could now alter the meaning of conversations in ways that even fluent Valoran speakers might not notice. And she had caused 17 diplomatic incidents that were attributed to cultural misunderstandings rather than deliberate manipulation. Her latest accomplishment involved a visiting Imperial dignitary who had come to inspect the Earth garrison. And Sujin translated his remarks during a formal dinner with subtle changes that made him sound dismissive of the local commanders. and the resulting conflict delayed a major security initiative by 3 months. The dignitary left Earth confused about why his reception had been so cold, and the garrison commanders filed complaints about his arrogance. And no one suspected that the pleasant translator had orchestrated the entire situation. With nothing more than carefully chosen words, an imperial accountant named Veristal was assigned to analyze the financial impact of the occupation, and his report concluded that at the current rate of losses, the Earth sector would be bankrupt within 4 years. He recommended immediate withdrawal as the only fiscally responsible option, and his superiors rejected his recommendation because withdrawal was politically impossible. And he was transferred to a different department where his conclusions would not cause further problems, but his numbers were leaked to other departments. And soon everyone in the imperial administration knew what the accountant had discovered. And the debate about Earth shifted from military strategy to economic survival. A Valoran soldier sat in his quarters, staring at the wall and trying to understand why he could not sleep anymore. And his mind kept returning to the human workers he supervised every day. And he remembered how they smiled at him constantly, and how they seemed so happy to serve, and how nothing he did ever seemed to bother them. Had served on 6 conquered worlds before Earth. And on every one of those worlds, the local population had shown resentment or fear or hatred. And he had understood those reactions because they made sense. The humans made no sense at all, and their constant pleasantness felt like a mask that hid something terrible. And he found himself flinching whenever a human worker approached him because he could not shake the feeling that they were always watching and always waiting and always planning. He requested a psychological evaluation, and the doctors told him he was suffering from stress-related anxiety. And they prescribed medication and recommended reduced duties. And he was not the only soldier who had made such requests. The medical facilities on Earth were treating more cases of anxiety and paranoia than any other occupied world in Imperial history. And the doctors could not explain why service on a pacified planet with cooperative inhabitants was more psychologically damaging than combat duty on active war zones. Vexus returned to the Senate chamber with updated projections that showed the situation was worse than her previous report had indicated. And she presented evidence that the human resistance was not decreasing despite increased security, but was actually growing more sophisticated and more effective. She proposed a compromise that would allow the Empire to save face while extracting itself from an impossible situation. And she suggested declaring Earth a low-priority administrative zone with minimal military presence, which would effectively mean abandoning the planet while technically maintaining imperial sovereignty. The military faction fought her proposal with everything they had, and they warned that showing weakness would encourage rebellion on other worlds. And they demanded more resources and more troops and more time to achieve victory, but the numbers were impossible to ignore. And even the most aggressive commanders could see that Earth was consuming resources that were needed elsewhere. And slowly the Senate began to accept that Vexus was right. The humans noticed none of these debates, and they continued their work with the same cheerful efficiency they had always displayed. And they had no way of knowing that their quiet war was winning. Jihei treated a Valoran officer who complained about headaches and fatigue, and she administered medication that would make his symptoms slightly worse over time. And she smiled at him and told him she hoped he would feel better soon. Do-hyun completed his shift and walked home past construction sites where his previous work was still waiting to fail. And he calculated that 4 more incidents would occur within the next month. Sujin finished translating a briefing that would reach Imperial High Command with subtle errors that would create confusion about Earth's strategic situation. None of them knew what the others were doing, and none of them cared, because they had each found their own way to fight, and that was enough. The Empire had come to Earth expecting submission. And instead, they had found something they had never encountered before and could not defeat. And now they were beginning to understand that some wars cannot be won, no matter how much power you possess. 1 year into the occupation, Admiral Corvith took command of the Earth occupation fleet with orders to solve the problem that had defeated every commander before him. He was a veteran of 30 campaigns and had never lost a battle. And he believed that every enemy could be defeated if you applied enough force and enough intelligence. And he was determined to prove that humans were no different from any other conquered species. His first order was to implement total surveillance on all human workers in Imperial facilities. And within weeks, every human was being watched and recorded and analyzed by advanced monitoring systems that could detect the slightest deviation from normal behaviors. Accidents continued. A power relay exploded in a garrison 300 kilometers from the nearest human worker, and the investigation revealed that the sabotage had been done 6 months earlier during construction. Long before the surveillance was installed, a database corruption erased critical supply records, and the logs showed that the corrupting code had been inserted 8 months ago by a human technician who had since been transferred to another facility on the other side of the planet. A Valoran officer died from a rare allergic reaction to his medication, and the autopsy revealed that the medication had been subtly altered using techniques that required advanced medical knowledge and access to specific compounds. And the alterations had been made over a period of 9 months in doses so small that each individual change was undetectable. Jihei watched the surveillance cameras being installed in her medical facility and felt nothing but calm satisfaction, because she had already done everything she needed to do. And now she could simply be a good worker and wait for the results. She had learned early that the key to success was patience. And she had spent months studying Valoran physiology and identifying vulnerabilities that their own doctors did not fully understand. And she had developed techniques that worked slowly over time and left no evidence. The officer she was currently treating would not die for another 4 months. And by then, no one would think to connect his death to the pleasant nurse who had cared for him so diligently. And even if they did suspect her, they would find nothing because she had been very careful across the city. Kang Do-yoon read about the communications relay collapse in an Imperial news bulletin, and the report blamed the failure on substandard materials from an off-world supplier. And no one questioned the human construction crew that had built the relay, because their work records were perfect. He had already moved on to other projects, and each one contained small modifications that would cause problems eventually. And he had calculated that his work over the past year would result in approximately 47 separate failures. Over the next 3 years, he did not know that 17 other construction workers across the planet had independently developed similar techniques, and he did not know that their combined efforts would cause over 600 failures in the same period. And this lack of coordination was precisely what made them impossible to stop. Bei Minho worked as a chef at the Imperial Officers Club, and his food was famous throughout the garrison for its quality and flavor. And the officers who ate there regularly considered themselves fortunate to have such a talented human preparing their meals. They did not notice that Minho had been adjusting the nutritional content of their food in ways that caused no immediate symptoms but would result in cognitive decline over time. And they did not realize that their difficulty concentrating, and their increasing irritability, and their occasional memory lapses were connected to anything they were eating. Minho had studied nutrition and biochemistry before the invasion, and he understood exactly how to create deficiencies that would mimic natural aging or stress. And he knew that no investigation would ever think to examine the food at the most prestigious dining establishment on the planet Admiral. Corvith received reports that showed a disturbing trend among his senior officers, and the reports indicated that decision-making quality had declined by 18% over the past year, and that error rates in strategic planning had increased significantly, and the medical staff attributed this to the stress of the occupation. He ordered mandatory health evaluations for all command personnel, and the evaluations found nothing abnormal because there was nothing to find. And the decline continued while the doctors searched for explanations that did not exist. A Valoran psychologist named Therasol was assigned to study human behavior and provide recommendations for improving cooperation. And she spent months observing human workers and interviewing them about their experiences and trying to understand how they thought. Her final report was classified at the highest level because its conclusions were too disturbing for general distribution. She wrote that humans were not rebelling out of hope or ideology or any desire for victory, and she explained that they had accepted defeat completely and understood that they could never overthrow imperial rule. And she said this was precisely what made them so dangerous. They are fighting because fighting is its own reward. She wrote, and they are causing damage because causing damage satisfies something fundamental in their psychology. And they will continue until they are stopped or until there is nothing left to destroy. She described a concept that had no equivalent in Valoran culture: a willingness to suffer any cost and endure any consequence for the simple pleasure of making an enemy suffer too. And she said that this trait made humans fundamentally different from every other species the Empire had encountered. Admiral Corvith read her report and dismissed it as academic speculation, because he could not accept that any rational being would behave the way she described. And he ordered increased security measures and stricter monitoring and harsher punishments for any human caught in suspicious activities. Humans who were caught accepted their punishments without complaint, and they did not inform on anyone else because there was no one else to inform on. And they returned to work after their sentences were complete and continued their private wars as if nothing had happened. The Valoran soldier named Kethvar broke down during a routine briefing and had to be sedated. And when he recovered, he explained that he could no longer bear the way the humans looked at him. And he said they were always smiling and always pleasant and always helpful. And he did not know what they were smiling about, but he was certain it was something terrible. He was transferred to another posting, and 3 more soldiers requested transfers in the following week. And within a month, the garrison had a waiting list of personnel who wanted to be reassigned anywhere else in the Empire. The humans noticed the transfers and continued their work without comment. And they smiled at the new soldiers who arrived and offered to help them adjust to life on Earth. And the cycle began again. Jahai finished her shift and walked through the surveillance-filled streets without concern, because she knew that watching her would reveal nothing. And she greeted the soldiers at the checkpoint with a polite nod and received a polite nod in return. And she went home to her small apartment and began planning the next phase of her work. She had identified 3 more officers who deserved her special attention, and she had developed new techniques that were even more difficult to detect. And she knew that she would probably be caught eventually, but she did not care because the damage she had already done could never be undone somewhere in the city. A pipe that Dohin had modified 6 months ago finally gave way, and water flooded a storage facility and destroyed equipment worth millions of credits. And the investigation blamed corrosion from an unknown contaminant somewhere in the officers' club. A senior commander finished his meal and complimented the chef on another excellent dinner. And Minho smiled and thanked him and began preparing the next course. The Empire was bleeding from 1,000 small wounds that could not be seen and could not be stopped and could not be explained. And Admiral Corvith stood in his command center watching reports of failures and accidents and unexplained losses. And for the first time in his long career, he began to consider the possibility that this was a war he could not win. 6 months after the conquest, Imperial High Command could no longer ignore the reports coming from Earth. The accident rate had increased by 300%, and equipment failures were occurring at levels that defied statistical probability. And personnel losses from non-combat incidents had exceeded those of 3 active war zones combined. So High Command made a decision that would change everything. They sent Inquisitor. Sir had crushed rebellions on 40 worlds across the Empire, and he had developed techniques for identifying resistance networks and eliminating them with surgical precision. And he had never failed to find the enemy, no matter how well they hid. So he arrived on Earth, confident that he would solve this mystery within weeks. His first action was to interview human workers at random, and he expected to encounter fear or defiance or the careful evasion that resistance members always displayed. But instead, he found something that disturbed him far more than any of those reactions. The humans were friendly. They answered his questions thoroughly and volunteered information without being asked. And they seemed genuinely eager to help him with his investigation. And not a single one of them showed any sign of guilt or deception that his trained eyes could detect. Cha Eunji was a data clerk in the Imperial Logistics Division. And when Sir interviewed her, she explained her job in careful detail and showed him exactly how she processed supply requests and managed inventory records. And she smiled throughout the conversation and offered to answer any follow-up questions he might have. She did not mention that she had been introducing small errors into the database for 18 months. And she did not explain how those errors had caused 17 supply ships to deliver their cargo to wrong locations. And she did not tell him that 3 frontier garrisons had gone without ammunition for months because of discrepancies that looked like simple clerical mistakes. Sir reviewed her work and found nothing suspicious, because Eunji had been very careful to make her sabotage look like the kind of random human error that happened in any large bureaucracy. And each individual mistake was too small to warrant investigation on its own. Lieutenant Rexus was a young Valoran officer assigned to assist the Inquisitor, and he had been stationed on Earth for 8 months and had developed what he thought was a good understanding of human behavior. But working with Sir forced him to see things he had been blind to before. He noticed how the human janitor in their building always seemed to be working near restricted areas. And he checked the access logs and discovered that this janitor had been entering secure zones for nearly 2 years without anyone questioning his presence. The janitor was arrested and interrogated, and Rexus observed the questioning with growing unease, because the man answered every question calmly and explained that he was simply doing his job and cleaning the areas he had been assigned to clean. And when asked about the sensitive documents and equipment he had access to, he seemed genuinely confused about why this would be a concern. They found nothing incriminating in his home and nothing suspicious in his communications, and they had no evidence that he had done anything wrong. But Rexus could not shake the feeling that the man knew exactly what he was doing and had simply been too careful to leave any proof. The janitor was released after 3 days, and he returned to work and thanked his supervisors for understanding that it was all a misunderstanding. And he smiled at Lieutenant Rexus when they passed in the hallway, and Rexus felt a chill run through his body that he could not explain. Sir expanded his investigation to cover the entire planet, and he requested access to every incident report and personnel file and security recording from the past 6 months. And he spent weeks analyzing the data, looking for patterns that would reveal the structure of the resistance network. What he found instead was something that made no sense at all. The incidents were not connected, and there was no communication between the humans involved in different accidents. And there was no evidence of any organization or leadership or coordination of any kind. But the attacks were clearly deliberate, and they were clearly effective, and they were clearly increasing in frequency and severity. He interviewed a human mechanic who had serviced a vehicle that later crashed, and the mechanic explained exactly what maintenance he had performed and showed documentation proving that he had followed all standard procedures. And the investigation concluded that the crash was caused by a manufacturing defect that no one could have predicted. But Malinser noticed something in the mechanic's eyes. A brief flicker of satisfaction when the crash was mentioned, and he realized with growing horror that the human had done something to that vehicle, but had been so careful and so thorough that there was no way to prove either. Interviewed a human cook who had prepared food for a barracks where 30 soldiers later fell ill, and the cook showed him the ingredients and the recipes and the preparation methods, and everything was exactly as it should be. And the illness was attributed to a contaminated water supply that affected the entire district. But Malinser watched the cook's hands as she worked, and he saw the precision and the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And he understood that this woman could poison an army and leave no trace that any investigation could find. He began to see the pattern that was not a pattern, the conspiracy that was not a conspiracy, and he understood why none of his techniques were working. There was no network to infiltrate because no network existed, and there were no leaders to eliminate because no one was leading, and there was no organization to disrupt because millions of humans had simply decided on their own to wage their own private wars. Against the Empire, each human was a single point of resistance that could not be connected to any other point. And each attack was designed by someone who understood their own job better than any investigator ever could. And each saboteur was protected by the simple fact that they had never communicated with anyone else. Malinser sat alone in his office and stared at his reports and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Of service to the Empire, he felt afraid. He called it meeting with Commander HFY and presented his findings. And when he finished speaking, the room was silent for a long time, because no one knew how to respond to what he had described. HFY asked how they could identify the saboteurs, and Malinser said that was impossible, because any human could be a saboteur, and most of them probably were. And there was no way to distinguish between a loyal worker and an enemy who had simply not acted. Yet HFY asked how they could prevent the attacks, and Malinser said that was also impossible because the humans understood Imperial systems better than the Imperials did, and they could find weaknesses that no security measure could anticipate. HFY asked what he recommended, and Malinser was quiet for a long time before he answered. Said it that in 40 years of service, he had never encountered an enemy like this. And he said that normal methods of suppression would not work because there was nothing to suppress. And he said that the only options were complete withdrawal or complete extermination, and neither option was acceptable to the Empire. He concluded his report with words that would haunt Imperial commanders for years to come. They are not soldiers, he said, and they are not rebels, and they are not even terrorists, because all of those things require organization and leadership and goals that can be understood and negotiated. They are something else entirely, he said, and the closest word I can find is maniacs, because they are waging a war they cannot win for reasons that make no sense, and they will keep fighting until there is nothing left to fight with. They are patient, he said, and that patience is more terrifying than any weapon I have ever faced. The Valaran Empire conquered Earth in 6 days. 6 days was all it took for humanity to fall, for their governments to surrender, for their militaries to lay down their weapons and accept defeat. And when the dust settled and the imperial flag flew over every capital city on the planet, the Valarans marked Earth as pacified and moved on to other matters. Commander HFY had seen dozens of conquered worlds in his long career, and Earth seemed no different from the rest, because the humans accepted their fate with the same quiet resignation that every other species showed when faced with Imperial might. And within 3 months, the occupation was running smoothly, with human workers filling roles in every garrison and facility across the planet. Jihei had been an emergency room nurse before the conquest, and now she worked as a medical assistant in the Imperial garrison at what used to be called Seoul. And every day she tended to sick and injured Valoran soldiers with gentle hands and a calm expression. And every day they thanked her for her dedicated service. She was good at her job. Everyone said so. And the Valoran officers often commented on how pleasant she was and how efficiently she worked. And when Senior Officer Krethnal fell ill with a mysterious ailment, Jihai was assigned to care for him personally. Krethnal had commanded the assault that destroyed the university district during the invasion, and Jihei had lost her younger brother in that attack. But she never mentioned this, and her expression never changed as she prepared his medications and checked his vital signs and made sure he was comfortable. The officer died 9 days later from organ failure that no Valoran doctor could explain, and Jihei attended his memorial service and expressed her condolences to his colleagues. And then she returned to work and waited for her next patient across the city. Kang Do-yoon lifted heavy equipment and followed orders and built whatever the Empire told him to build. And he never complained and never caused trouble, and always finished his work ahead of schedule, which made him a model worker in the eyes of his supervisors. Doyen had been a construction foreman before the invasion, and he understood how things were built, and more importantly, how things could be made to fail. And when his crew was assigned to construct a new communications relay on the outskirts of the city, he made sure to introduce certain small modifications that no one would notice. The modifications were subtle, just tiny adjustments to load-bearing components and minor alterations to power distribution systems, and they would cause no immediate problems. But Doyen had calculated that in approximately 47 days the entire structure would experience a catastrophic failure that would look exactly like a manufacturing defect. He finished the project 3 days early and received the commendation from his Valoran supervisor, and he smiled and thanked them for the recognition and moved on to his next assignment. Park Sujin worked as a translator for Imperial officers, and she was considered invaluable because she spoke 5 languages and always made communication between humans and Valorans smooth and effortless. And the officers she served trusted her completely. They did not know that Sujin had spent the first 6 months of the occupation memorizing every Valoran phrase and idiom she encountered. And they did not know that she had identified exactly which words could be mistranslated in ways that would cause confusion without being obviously wrong. When Commander Thexis Vaya gave a speech about Imperial unity to a crowd of human workers, Sujin translated his words with perfect accuracy, except for 3 small changes that made his message sound condescending rather than inspiring. And the humans in the crowd heard exactly what Sujin wanted them to hear. The commander never understood why the humans seemed less enthusiastic after his speech. And Sujin apologized for any confusion and promised to do better next time. And she smiled her pleasant smile and waited for the next opportunity in the Imperial Intelligence Division. A young analyst named Velarin was growing concerned about patterns she could not explain, because the accident reports from Earth showed a steady increase in equipment failures and supply shortages and unexplained illnesses among Imperial personnel. She compiled her findings and presented them to her supervisor, who dismissed her concerns immediately, because the numbers were still within acceptable parameters and there was no evidence of organized resistance. And besides, the humans had no military structure left, and no weapons, and no way to coordinate any kind of rebellion. Velarin accepted this explanation, but she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, because she had studied the behavior of humans extensively, and she noticed things that others did not. Like how the human workers always seemed so helpful and so cooperative and so eager to please on every other conquered world. The local population showed resentment or fear or anger. But the humans smiled constantly and volunteered for extra duties and never seemed to cause any problems. And Valorin found this deeply unsettling, even though she could not articulate why she watched the human workers in her facility going about their tasks with cheerful efficiency. And she noticed how they greeted each other with small nods and brief glances that seemed meaningless but somehow felt significant. And she wondered if she was imagining patterns where none existed. Meanwhile, the accidents continued to accumulate across the planet. And a transport vehicle lost its brakes on a mountain road, killing 3 Valoran soldiers. And a water treatment facility experienced contamination that sickened an entire barracks. And a weapons depot suffered a fire that destroyed equipment worth millions of Imperial credits. Each incident was investigated, and each investigation concluded that the cause was mechanical failure or human error or simple bad luck. And no connection was ever found between any of the events because there was no connection to find. The humans were not coordinating with each other, and they were not following orders from any resistance leader. And they were not even aware of what other humans were doing in other parts of the planet. But somehow they had all arrived at the same conclusion independently. They could not fight the Empire with weapons, and they could not resist with military force, and they could not win any kind of conventional war. But they could make the occupation expensive and frustrating and exhausting in 1,000 small ways that could never be traced back to any single source. Aja finished her shift and walked home through streets that were cleaner and more orderly than they had been before the invasion. And she passed Valoran soldiers who nodded at her respectfully. And she nodded back and kept walking with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression calm and pleasant. She did not know Do-Yun or Sujin, and she had never coordinated with anyone about anything. And she had simply decided on her own that she would use her skills and her position to hurt the Empire in whatever way she could. And she suspected that she was not the only one who had made this decision. The Empire had conquered Earth in 6 days. But they had not defeated humanity, because humanity had simply chosen a different kind of war. A war without soldiers, and without battles, and without glory. A war of patience and spite and quiet determination. Valorin filed her concerns in a report that no one would read. And Thexisvar congratulated himself on a successful occupation. And somewhere in the city, a communications relay stood waiting for the day it would collapse. And Yoon-Ji-hae lay awake in her small apartment thinking about her brother and planning her next patient. The Empire did not know it yet, but they had made a terrible mistake, because they had assumed that conquest meant victory and that surrender meant submission. And they had never considered the possibility that a species might keep fighting long after they had officially lost. The humans smiled and served and obeyed. And the Empire saw compliance where they should have seen something else entirely.